Let me very warmly welcome all of you for this second ABA webinar on strengthening cybersecurity preparedness for banks. Suresh and the ABA President Jonathan Alice joins us from this office. Uh, I understand we have over 377 and still counting participants present at the moment, and over 900 participants registered for this event, which is very encouraging. This is the second webinar we organized. The last webinar in June was a broad topic, sharing learnings and best practices across banks operating in various regions on preparing and managing the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we had over 400 participants for that session. And today's webinar is more focused on one topic, which is really cybersecurity, which is a key issue on many board agendas with the massive digital transformation that has taken place and the digital transactions that are taking place across various digital channels post the pandemic. We are very fortunate to have a panel comprising bankers, academia, consultancy, regional associations, and experts. And I have no doubt this session will be very informative to all of you present. It also gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Eugene Acevedo, who is the president and the CEO of RCBC Bank. RCBC Bank has been very active in ABA deliberations over the last 10-15 years. They have also served as presidents of ABA over the years, and he will be your moderator today. And I have no doubt he will introduce the panel and start the proceedings. Over to you, Eugene. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dilshan. By the way, we haven't introduced Dilshan. Dilshan Rodrigo is the COO of Hatton National Bank, and is the chairman of the ABA Policy Advocacy Committee. Thank you again, Dilshan. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on which region you are located or which time zone. Some of us will remember, if you are old enough, you will remember the time when cybersecurity consisted mostly of limited access to the data center. This was before local area networks, before the proliferation of servers, before mobile banking, before employees worked remotely using VPNs. All of these multiply the points of vulnerability, increasing risk of cyber attacks from a bored university student or a nation-state attacker unleashing a day zero malware. With the acceleration of digital transformation, with the democratization and wide reach of financial services, cybersecurity has become even more complex and costly. The amount of money spent by each bank on cybersecurity, either through prevention or actual loss, has risen substantially. This afternoon, we are joined by 6 gentlemen. I will introduce them one by one later. Experts all, who will help us understand the topic at hand. Our first speaker is Jeremy Prenio on cyber risk regulation and supervision. Jeremy is Senior Advisor in the Financial Stability Institute at the Bank of International Settlements. He is involved in managing the FSI's outreach program for banking supervision. He contributes to the Institute's published work on policy implementation and other policy-related material. Previously, he was Deputy Director for Regulatory Affairs at the Institute of International Finance in Washington, D.C. He also worked as a regulator in the Philippines, where he headed the task force on Basel II implementation. He has an MA from the University of the Philippines School of Economics. Jeremy, please.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I'm not sure, are you going to introduce one by one first, or
no, you
should
can,
I go through my presentation now?
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think Mig will pull out my presentation shortly.
There it is, yeah.
Okay, great. Again, thank you very much, Eugene, for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for the Asian Bankers Association for inviting me to this webinar. It's both a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. The last time I was at an ABA event was some years back in Taipei, and I was wearing a different hat then, and how I wish that this event would have been in Taipei as well, but unfortunately, during the current circumstances, we couldn't do that. But anyway, before I start, let me apologize to the participants that I couldn't really stay throughout the duration of the webinar. I wouldn't be here for the Q&A session because I have to leave right after my presentation. I'm actually on holidays right now up in the mountains, so my background is real. It's not a virtual background. And we're here for a week, and it's only today that the sun is out, so my family will kill me if I won't join them after my presentation. So again, apologies for that. Maybe just a few words about the BIS and the FSI for those of you who may not be familiar with the organization. So the Bank for International Settlements is the oldest international organization in the world. It was founded in 1930, so which makes the BIS 90 years old this year. It's a peculiar international organization in the sense that its membership is not by governments of countries, right, but rather it is by central banks of countries. And so that's why the BIS is known as the central bank of central banks. Now, the Financial Stability Institute, or the FSI, is a unit within the BIS that promotes international regulatory standards and sound supervisory practices. And in doing so, one of our key activities is the publication of papers that basically describe these standards and practices. And the things that I'm going to talk about during my presentation would be based on two such papers. The first paper was issued in 2017, which was on cyber risk regulation and supervision. And that one we updated over the summer for the purpose of contributing a chapter to a book titled Handbook of FinTech, which we are developing together with a few academics here in Europe. And then the second paper from which I'm going to lift a few information from is a paper that we published last year on red team testing frameworks. Okay, and throughout my presentation, although the cyber risk regulation supervision is a very broad area, I'm only going to highlight a few important areas that I thought might be of interest to the group here. So if you can turn to the next slide, please. Slide 3, please. Mig?
Mig, can you move to the next slide, please?
Yeah, that one. Yes. The second slide is just basically the usual disclaimer. So let me begin here. Being from an international organization, so let me start by providing an overview of the work on cybersecurity at the international level, particularly among financial authorities. Now, the picture I have here is a picture of one of the meeting rooms at the BIS. This is where the governors regularly meet, and this is also where standard setting bodies that are hosted by the BIS, such as the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, and CPMI, regularly hold their meetings as well. Now, the things that I highlighted here, these are just some of the key examples of work in the area of cybersecurity at the international level by groups that I thought might be relevant to the audience in this webinar. Of course, there are several other groups that are working on cybersecurity at the international level, given the importance of the topic for the financial sector in particular, as well as the whole economy in general. If we can turn to slide 4, please. Yes, thank you very much. So let me begin also by giving an overview of the regulatory expectations when it comes to cybersecurity strategy, governance, and risk management. In terms of cybersecurity strategy, actually only very few regulators expect or require their banks to have an explicit cybersecurity strategy in place, because many regulators expect this strategy to be covered already in the general risk management or IT security frameworks of banks. Similarly, many regulators also consider that the roles of the board and the roles of the senior management of banks when it comes to cybersecurity are already covered in banks' risk management frameworks. But let me just say a few words about the role of the Chief Information Security Officer, because I believe a couple of my co-panelists are CISOs. So let me touch on that for a bit. So the designation of CISOs is not really required in many jurisdictions, although it's now a common practice among large and globally active banks and even some regional banks as well. And you know, in some cases, CISOs report to the Chief Risk Officer. In other cases, they report to the Chief Information Officer. Now, reporting to the CRO, to the Chief Risk Officer, may be a natural choice, considering that many regulators, you know, consider cyber risk as just part or as just one of the other risks that banks have to manage. So that means it should fall within the remit of CROs, right? The concern, however, is that most CROs typically are not really into technology. And so they might tend to focus more on the financial risks, which they are more familiar with. So that's one of the concerns of the regulators. And the other concern also is that CROs might tend to focus more on compliance, which may be in conflict with the approaches of the Chief Information Security Officer in putting in place cybersecurity controls that may still allow some innovation to take place. So this particular concern comes from, you know, regulators whose authority, whose regulatory authority may be more supportive of innovation in general. Now, reporting to the CIO, to the Chief Information Officer, the advantage of that is that CIOs, of course, are more familiar with technology. The concern, however, is that the role of CIOs in business operations, because they basically provide the technology needs of the business units, that you might have a scenario where your first and second line of defense are in the same or under the same person. So that's basically the concern of a number of regulators. Now, given the importance of cybersecurity and cyber resilience in general, there's now an emerging consensus, if I may, among regulators that CISOs might have to report directly to the CEO or to the board, given the important role that they have in overseeing bank-wide cybersecurity. Okay, so that's on governance. Now, let me move on to risk management. Here, many regulators expect banks to be able to map their business services to the supporting assets, and also to be able to identify which of their business services are critical, one, to their operations, second, to the provision of services to customers, and third, to the financial system as a whole. Okay, and then the idea is that banks should be able to prioritize and deploy their cybersecurity resources to these critical business services. Many regulators also think that it's quite important, the role of bank staff is quite important in cybersecurity. So there are many regulators now with requirements in place for banks to have the right cybersecurity resources in place. The thing is, it goes beyond that, because even if, you know, a bank has all the, you know, the cybersecurity personnel of banks are quite knowledgeable and have all the necessary skills to mitigate and address cyber risk. But if the general staff do not have cybersecurity awareness, then this is all for naught, right? So that's why there's now growing emphasis among regulators that to require banks to have cybersecurity awareness and competency training for all their staff, starting from the bottom all the way to the top. Okay. Can you go to slide 5, please? The next one, please. Slide 5, please, Meek. Yes, that's right. So now, in terms of supervisory practices in those 3 areas, strategy, governance, and risk management, supervisory assessments are based on the regulatory expectations that I just outlined. But in addition to those, supervisors also look at established industry standards, such as the NIST, ISO, COVID, and CIS frameworks. They tend to look at the standards in assessing whether the banks have the right and adequate cybersecurity controls in place. Supervisors also assess, supervisory assessments also include testing and challenging banks' controls and how they remediate the issues that they identify. And this can be done in various ways. For example, supervisors can review banks' responses to a supervisory questionnaire. Supervisors can also assess audit reports, or they can review control testing reports. Or the testing and challenging of banks' controls could also be part of a more formal testing program. Make the next slide, please. Yes, so the CPMI, and speaking of a formal testing program, the CPMI and IOSCO guidance that I mentioned in my earlier slide actually calls for the establishment of a comprehensive cyber resilience framework, and that includes a testing program that could employ several testing methodologies. And I put here just a few examples of those testing methodologies. So you have vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, and red team testing. I won't go into the details of these because I know that the audience here may be more familiar with these methodologies than I am. So let me just go to my next slide. Yes, so in this slide, I think there's now, among the testing methodologies that I mentioned earlier, there's now increasing recognition among authorities, among regulators and supervisors of the increasing importance of red team testing. And the table here basically shows you the jurisdictions that have red team testing frameworks in place and the key features of their respective frameworks. Now, this recognition by the different regulators and supervisors come from the fact that red team testing frameworks provide some benefits not only to the banks, but also to the supervisors or regulators themselves. So benefits on the bank side is that obviously red team testing provides them a structured methodology for identifying weaknesses in their cybersecurity practices, and also a way for establishing remediation plans. But aside from that obvious benefit, red team testing also enables them to better organize and process threat intelligence. It fosters closer coordination among different units within the bank. It promotes stronger cybersecurity awareness across the bank because, in doing red team testing, you're not only testing the information systems, but you're actually looking at people, processes, and technology as well. And then lastly, it also raises accountability of the board and senior management when it comes to cybersecurity, because at some point they will have to be involved in the red team testing exercise as well. Benefits to supervisors, again, obviously it enables them to better understand the bank's cybersecurity capabilities, but aside from that, it also enables them to identify common weaknesses and strengths in cybersecurity across the whole financial industry. Now, of course, this is not to say that red team testing have some issues and challenges that have to be addressed. But in the interest of time, I am not going through the different issues and challenges related to red team testing in my presentation. But at the bottom of the table here, I provided the title of the paper that I mentioned earlier. This is the second paper I mentioned earlier on red team testing frameworks that was published last year. So if you would want to go into the details of the different red team testing frameworks in different jurisdictions, feel free to go to our website and check out that paper. Okay, next slide, please. Now, going to cybersecurity incident response and recovery and the regulatory expectations or requirements in this area. Indeed, I think it's quite common for regulators to expect banks or to require banks to establish a framework for incident response and recovery. However, most of these requirements are not cyber specific, so they are quite general. They're general requirements for having a response and recovery framework for any incident, not just cyber. But it might change with the issuance by the Financial Stability Board earlier this year of a consultation document on effective practices for cyber incident response and recovery. That consultation document aims to provide a toolkit of effective practices, and these are structured across the 7 components that I listed here on this slide. Now, there is a plenary session today of the Financial Stability Board. So the final document of this paper, the effective practices for cyber incident response and recovery, should be issued shortly after the plenary session today. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of supervisory practices, the focus of supervisors when it comes to cyber incident response and recovery is on how the plans are triggered, the bank's ability to implement the plans, and preservation of data in critical systems. In many jurisdictions, also supervisors and banks conduct or use exercises to train and practice how they would respond to a cyber incident. So for example, there is an annual financial sector operational resilience exercise in the UK, which incorporates cyber-specific scenarios. In Japan, supervisors in banks conduct tabletop exercises to improve their communication and coordination mechanism in the event of a cyber incident. And I'm sure jurisdictions that are covered or that are represented in this webinar have similar exercises as well. Okay, next slide, please. Now, let me go to third-party dependencies or third-party arrangements and the regulatory expectations or requirements in this area. Traditionally, third parties relate to the providers of outsourced activities, but then in the context of cybersecurity, regulators tend to view third parties in a much broader sense to include providers of products and services that are not typically considered as outsourced. For example, providers of power supply, telecommunication lines, and so on and so forth. It may also include interconnected counterparties, for example, payment and settlement systems, trading platforms, central counterparties, and the like. The reason is that these third parties may hold or may be able to access non-public information of the bank and its customers. And in addition to that, cybersecurity vulnerabilities in these third parties could also become channels of attack on the bank itself. So that's why in many cases, regulators treat these third parties as similar to an outsourced activity. And in most cases, also regulators require their banks to have an outsourcing framework in place, and this outsourcing framework should take into account business continuity and information confidentiality and integrity. Okay. Now, use of the cloud by banks is also increasingly getting a lot of attention right now from authorities, with a growing number of jurisdictions having specific regulatory requirements for the use of the cloud. So there are now specific expectations for control and location of data. So for example, this may take the form of requirements of the location of at least one data center for cloud computing services provided in the country or region be identified, or that data ownership control, and location be identified and monitored as part of the service agreement. However, specific technical and operational requirements or commonalities in specific technical and operational requirements are still not emerging. So authorities seem to be emphasizing different aspects of controls to ensure information confidentiality and integrity. So for example, in a few jurisdictions, authorities explicitly require encryption solutions for confidential data to be under the bank's control. In other cases, yes.
Just a few seconds to go, please.
Yes, so I'm already on almost to my last slide. So in other cases, regulators may regulate the transfers of data abroad, and in a few cases also, authorities require explicit client consent for data handling before they turn over the data to the cloud provider. And to my last slide, please. Yes, so I think that the main issue when it comes to supervisory practices related to third parties is whether the supervisors are able to examine the third parties either directly or indirectly. And it all depends on whether the supervisors have the powers to do so. In most cases, supervisors put the onus on the banks to ensure that the third parties they deal with have the same stringent security controls in place that supervisors expect of them. And in some cases, supervisors are actually able to assess and examine the third parties themselves, either because they have the authority to do so or because they require their banks SLAs with the third party to include a clause that would allow them to examine the third parties themselves. So that's actually the end of my presentation, Eugene, and sorry for taking up more time.
No, it's okay. We just want to make sure that you spend time with your family. Thank you very much. Insightful and interesting presentation. Now, before we move on to our second speaker, just a few ground rules. For participants who would like to ask questions from any of the speakers, you may do so by clicking and posting your question on the Q&A or the chat box located at the bottom of the screen. We will try to cover those questions during the Q&A session later, after all the speakers have completed their presentations. Let us now proceed to the next speaker. Our second speaker is Alan Cliff Tabor. He will share case studies on how banks, share case studies of banks on how cyber risk vulnerabilities can be exposed. Alan is a partner in Oliver Wyman's Singapore office and is a member of the digital and corporate and institutional banking practices. He works with the region's leading financial institutions on a wide variety of topics and problems. He also advises CEOs across industries on topics like digitization, digital operating models, fintech collaboration, business transformation, tech risk, cyber risk, and more. His recent assignments include cybersecurity diagnostics to identify weaknesses and improvement opportunities for a Southeast Asian bank, and the implementation of cyber and IT risk management for a Southeast Asian financial institution. Alan, please, your turn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking everyone for the time and the opportunity to speak to all of you this afternoon or morning, depending where you are. And I'll wait for Mig to put up the pages.
Mig?
You sharing the deck, Mig?
We're having a bit of trouble here. There it is coming up.
Here we are. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you for your time. Mig will move us to presentation mode and start scrolling. Yes, so I intend to share today some practical lessons learned that is based on some hands-on experiences that we at Oliver Wyman have had with a number of our clients Some of them we advised pursuant to a specific event or a certain compromise that unfortunately has occurred in the context of some of the recent developments and changes. Other experiences are based more on ongoing learning and what we see as developments in the industry. If you want to stay, I mean, at least on my screen, Mig, this is pretty much catching 92% of the surface, so I'm okay if you stay in this mode. But, good. So let me start with a couple of insights that are basically what we see in the context, again, of the pandemic of COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on many institutions and how they have to manage cyber and some of the cyber-related challenges that they're dealing with. So first and foremost, it's obvious that organizations have had for a while, some of them still do and will continue for a long while to come. The organizations have had to change their operating model in the sense that many facilities were not and continue to not be available to most people. There's a lot more unique arrangements of working from home, and this was quoted in a report from NetScout that was released, I think, yesterday. Basically, they said the COVID-19 pandemic created a seismic shift in how we work and live and added rocket fuel to the growth of attacks. And that's pretty much what they did, because it's a deadly combination between changes to operating model and operating rhythm. And at the same time, there's a heightened, I would say, motivation and an identification of opportunity by potential attackers, regardless of whether the attackers are operating for financial gain or operating for other motivations. We do see substantial increase in cyber activity overall. The same report says that for cyber criminals, the COVID-19 pandemic is nothing short of an outstanding business opportunity, and they have taken full advantage of it. And I should mention that all of this is happening when banks and other financial institutions have limited ability to engage their clients and the suppliers and the employees. So institutions themselves are accelerating digitization. They are enhancing channels, creating channels, building new digital capabilities. And this launch of additional capabilities, additional channels, actually leads to the potential, at least, introduction of additional vulnerabilities into the landscape. And also, that extreme speed pressure to release more and more capabilities and enhance channels and allow business to continue is coming at some level, coming with compromises. And we've had many cases. I think some of the most well-known is the one where Bank of America released a new online solution for a check protection scheme. It had to be released quickly, part of some government support scheme. It had to be released quickly. It was released with some compromises and some vulnerabilities, and ended up leading to a leak of millions of records to public domain. You can move to the next slide. Next page, please. Yeah. So yes, we've seen perpetrators and threat actors definitely taking advantage. We've seen many examples. Fake apps in app stores, a dramatic increase in malware and phishing attacks and ransomware. We have a case study about one ransomware situation in the next couple of pages, but clearly for anyone following in the news, you don't have to be a cyber professional or risk professional to realize that there's a dramatic increase in activity. These are just a couple of examples from our region with and at an age where the public was just so thirsty for information, they would practically click on anything and install anything that would promise them more information and some more sharing and some more transparency, supposed transparency about the pandemic situation and what's happening in their jurisdiction. And when they install that, unfortunately, more frequently than we would like to believe, they installed a false application and they ended up creating a leak, either a private one, or one that would affect the organization or the employer. Move to the next page for a couple of statistics. Just some numbers to boggle the mind. More than double of increase in ransomware attacks during the first couple of months of the pandemic. Dramatic increase in traditional forms of hacking attempts. 300% increase in cybercrime reports to FBI, specifically in North America. But look at those numbers. I think they speak for themselves. There's some mounting evidence that this is a business opportunity for attackers, and the primary target is commonly banks. Move please to the next page. A couple of situations, more or less famous. One case study, a ransom attack on Finastra. Finastra, for those who somehow don't know it, is a provider of software and technology solutions to the financial industry. And even them, the tech experts, who are supposed to not only be good at protecting themselves, but actually trusted in protecting the institutions to whom they provide software and other services, they themselves became vulnerable with a very, very classic ransomware sequence where perpetrators were waiting for just the right time after installing the malware quite a long time ago. They expanded the reach into the organization, and until they got the malware installed in a number of critical pieces of IT assets, eventually detonated the ransomware at the most sensitive time, where the entire workforce had to be moved to connect remotely and effectively disabled the organization's ability to operate, hurt its reputation quite dramatically, and had a couple of other effects. Similar attacks happened again at tech giants, including Garmin. Garmin, as you probably read from public sources, is not just a manufacturer of wristwatches and fitness equipment. Garmin is actually a manufacturer of mission-critical communication and navigation equipment to marine travel and aviation, and the infrastructure was disabled. They ended up pretty much forced to break the law in their own country and pay the attackers in order to release some of the assets. Next page. Yeah, and we've seen an increase in cynicism. We identified specific case or specific attack vector that was not exactly anticipated. Mobile device management solutions, the very technology that's supposed to safeguard mobile devices and protect organizational assets from the vulnerabilities that going mobile may inject into the infrastructure. That very solution ended up being the platform that injected the compromise. In February this year, there was a discovery of some malware that is taking advantage of more mobile device management solutions that are installed with one or two missing steps. In other words, on-device network protection was either not enabled or not configured properly, which introduced a sort of a backdoor. And in some cases, as one of the attacks that were orchestrated using this platform ended up with infecting 75% of the company's devices and basically allowing massive amounts of information to be siphoned out, leading quite a lot of pain. And again, this is a classic, as you can see on this page, a classic situation whereby the widening attack surface and the wholesale move to work remotely and rely on mobile devices is the very way to introduce the leak or create the leak. Next page. So again, move to a little bit of practicalities to the extent that the time permits. What do we see as the key necessary steps for financial institutions in particular, but for the broader industry, I would say, even more so? Three main steps and areas that require attention. First of all, an inward look. A set of steps that are supposed to or intended to enhance security controls in response to the changes in attack surface, operating model, and offensive activity. We need to respond, and we need to respond fast. What does it mean? I mean, just to illustrate with the simplest of explanation, if a trading platform was designed with user access controls that are based on the premise that the user is logging in from a company-owned desktop that is connected to the company-operated network within the company's premises using hard LAN cables, then, you know, user access control for such a situation can be, I don't want to say more relaxed, but configured in a certain way based on certain assumptions. However, if now the same employee, a trader in this case, or anyone else, even a risk manager or what have you, ends up logging to the same system from the confines of her or his home using a mobile device and logging through a wireless network that may be a secure private network, or might be, as we've seen happen quite a lot of cases during the pandemic, be a public network, or maybe a neighbor's unsecure network. That calls for completely different user access control, and the controls that were designed to be suitable for a desktop wired in the office are completely inadequate for this situation. So there is a need to assess and strengthen technical and non-technical security controls. And there is a need, if you move to the next page, and there is a need to focus first and foremost on mission-appropriate remote access policies and controls, because this is arguably the biggest set of vulnerabilities that get introduced during the pandemic and as a result of the new operating models. And I would say last but not least, the increase of communication with management staff and customers, everyone, and suppliers too. Everyone needs to understand that the situation is different. Everyone needs to understand the realities are different, and everyone needs to understand the consequences of those changes on the security posture and what is considered good behavior. Good behavior in the past may not be good behavior of the present and the future. Communication, retraining could be among one of the more critical and more effective ways to control some of the vulnerabilities that get introduced.
1 minute more, Alan.
Sure.
Thank you.
Next page. A couple of, just a quick introduction of a couple of control domains. Reevaluate levels of staff access with an eye to restrict and limit and be even more selective in who gets to access what type of information, what type of platform, with what type of credentials. Risk profiling staff based on the access and other considerations that may be applicable to the profile and to the information that they need to use as part of the job. Blocking loopholes for data extraction. Guess what's going to happen when employees are faced with adversity? They themselves are stressed with the economic conditions, with understanding that the company is not in as good a condition as it was before. They are under tremendous stress to operate and perform and deliver. And as a result, they might be tempted to take some shortcuts and loopholes in order to have to continue to be effective based on the purest of intentions, but as a result may end up leading to compromises. Just to name a couple of things to consider. If you move to the next page, we also have to look externally. For institutions that still do not have a cyber threat intelligence capability or developed enough cyber threat intelligence capability, this needs to be prioritized. In a time of uncertainty and in times where changes are evolving rapidly, you need to have more information, and you need to know who might be talking about you and about potential vulnerabilities in your environment, and who might already have compromised you and trying to sell your information already. And the second point over here, third parties. Third parties has proven to be, during this pandemic, during this crisis, a huge soft spot and a source of risk. They always have been, but now if you, who are members of established banks that have a robust and mature control environment, if you have to take some shortcuts just in order to stay in business, you can imagine what your suppliers and third parties and partners and fintechs and startups might be going through. They are far more likely to take compromises and shortcuts, and they are far more likely to become a source of risk. And one needs to look at the entire value chain of third parties in order to understand where risk is going to come from, where compromises might be coming from, and what you can do, not just contractually, but operationally, in order to overcome this. And next page. This is what we see. We see CISOs, CROs, and top management basically looking at a couple of time horizons, immediately reviewing some of the security control environments and some of those elements that I mentioned today, but also looking into the future, having a 6 to 18 months program to adjust to the new normal and stabilize a new reality. And in the longer run, a much deeper review of overall cyber information security strategy that would include all of those elements that appear here on the page. And I would conclude with that. Thank you. Sorry if I breached the time.
Perfect. Thank you. That was very interesting. Our next speaker is Suresh Emmanuel. Suresh will talk about strengthening cybersecurity preparedness for banks. He is currently the CISO of Hatta National Bank. He has extensive background in security implementation, all stages of IT security audits, IT security reviews, and he is qualified and experienced in the various ISOs like Information Security Management System, IT Quality Management System, IT Service Management System, among others. He has conducted various assignments for leading blue chip companies and conglomerates in Sri Lanka, not just banks, but other companies as well. Telecoms, manufacturing, and other various industrial sectors. Suresh, it's your turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. Let me share my slide here. All right, so I hope my slide is visible.
Yes, it's good.
All right, so let me quickly move into my first slide. So it's actually, I want to actually elaborate on a holistic view of cyber risk in banking sector in a nutshell. So if you take the preparedness for cyber risk or the cyber attacks, always remains patchy for banks. It is the way it is even for the countries like Asian countries like Sri Lanka, even for the global banks as well. So that's one of the reasons, because that if you ask probably the number of CEOs whether your bank is 100% or a acceptable level of prepared for a cyber attacks, again the answer remains patchy as well. Because that's mainly that to answer that question confidently, you have to be thorough on that your technology perspectively you are competent, and also your human perspective, your regulator and the statutory perspective you are competent. So, and also in terms of the compliance perspective. So because of those reasons, the cyber risk in banking is always, and the preparedness for the cyber risk is always remains patchy. And also if you take the technologies and threats, both are evolving. But if you take today's context, the way we bank today is not the way we used to bank probably about 25 to 30 years ago. So if you take with the digital transformation, a lot of digital initiatives are taking place, including nowadays the mobile banking, digital wallets, blockchain-based applications, and open API-based banking. So we open actually a lot of channels to our customers for their convenience, to make sure that the banking is also part of their day-to-day life, in terms of as part of their in terms of their achieving their part of their day-to-day stages in their life, from starting from their education to professional their professional jobs to their marriage to all part of life. We want the banks to be part of their life. So with that to be compensated and complement with that life cycle, we used to come up with different technologies, different strategies, and different kind of complements to add value to the customers. So with that, we also open new threat exposure, and also because of that, with the convenience part of it also, therefore the customer at the same time, there are new threats are evolving as part of the digital transformation. And if you take currently one of the key challenge for a bank is the basically there's not much of the available, not much of the resources. So basically with the demanding the both evolving threats and evolving technologies, we should have enough resources to cope up with them. But currently there is not. Obviously, in terms of the cyber and the security risk is one of the key risk, if demanded risk in today's context. But if you take currently, there's not much of risk, not much of skills to cope up with the demand. And also apart from human risk, then also the not availability of the technological resources also is one of the key challenge for the banks. And the response strategies are also evolving in the banking sector. But if you take most of the time, the response strategies are mostly trial and error based, or the lessons learned based, or based on certain incidents only. We sometimes, most of the time, we align our response strategies in the banks. But whereas if you take to based on the business requirement and the business strategy, we should have a kind of proactive response strategy as a banks, but currently it is still evolving, unfortunately. So based on we also learn from certain incidents, then only we evolve our response strategies. So unfortunately, that's the way it is. I'll move into the corporate governance of the cyber security. So it is one of the key and the very important factor, because the tone has to be set from the top. So from the board of directors level to the corporate management and the subsequent pillars, the importance of the cybersecurity should be actually come from the top. And also, if you take the CISO's role, is currently evolving role in countries like Sri Lanka, and even it is in terms of the globally as well. But we actually, one of my fellow panelists spoke about whom should the CISO should reports to. So those are the key, challenges and discussions currently being going on, and certain aspects being evolving in terms of the particular subject line. But if you take the CISO should have, regardless of whom he is reporting, based on the, probably it might come with your statutory or regulatory requirement as well. Maybe your regulator might say that the CISO should report to whom, indirectly in maybe part of their directives, or they may not. So based on where you place the CISO in, regardless of actually where you place your CISO in your corporate governance structure, you have to make sure he has the adequate authority, decision-making power to do his job adequately. So that's one of the key things you have to make sure in the banking. And regardless of whatever the technological implementations and the controls we implement, but as human, the awareness remains still low. So that's one of the key issues, as globally the organization face, because to the raising the employee awareness is one of the biggest challenge for the organizations. So it's like this. So for a hacker, it's rather breaking few firewalls and the security controls on the perimeter level, it is really easy to send a phishing or a spam email with a malware and then actually gaining a backdoor to the organization. So on the later slides, I'll be showing certain really important facts and figures of the such incidents happen in the bank. So based on that, you will realize how really important it is. And there's a growing trend in the needs of the basically need to have a better harness of the data analytics. So basically threat intel and machine learning and the AI capabilities. So these capabilities has to be used in the security information and cybersecurity domain as well. So we need to harness on the data whatever available in the globally as well as within the organization, and based on the intelligence we get, we need to develop our new strategies to cope up with the coming cyber attacks. So those are the key needs when it comes to, and the key requirements and the key points when it comes to cyber risk in banking. So I'll move into a very interesting study being done by the SANS Institute along with the longest research paper on cyber risk in banking. So based on that, the research paper, actually, if you take the cyber incidents in the bank, about 79, it's almost 80%. 80% of the attacks are mainly spam attacks. If you take the 50% is the phishing attacks. So as I said, so if you take the direct hacking and basically trying to break your perimeter and coming to, it's around less than 10%. So as I previously mentioned, for an attacker, it's really easy to manipulate a user rather trying to break into the perimeter level security. So it's really important. That's why it's really important to raise the user awareness. And with that context, if we go to the banking cyber risk radar, the phishing and the spam-based attacks are the most prominent attacks which are taking place. So based on, if you take even the smishing and the spam attacks, spam in the spam in instant messaging based attacks. So, and the mobile malware. So these the ones which I have circled in red, actually I have highlighted in the this red square are the attacks which are most prominently taking place in the banking sector. So basically the malware attacks, including the ransomware attacks, are now taking place, including the zero-day attacks, which actually bypasses your existing whatever the signature-based conventional technology you have to protect your infrastructure. So those kind of attacks are taken. So most likely the employee will get a spam or a phishing attack rather basically a hack, the organization getting a hacking attack. Right. So
Suresh, 2 minutes to go, please.
Okay, if we take the key challenges in dealing with the cyber threats, so one of the key challenges when it come to the cyber threat is the difficulties in the keeping up with the rapidly changing cyber risk, because as you said that the digital transformation and the technologies are evolving, the cyber threats also are evolving. So it's really difficult to keep up with the challenge. And also the technology limitations such as the hardware and the software limitation, which contributes about the 39 to the 40%. So the difficult part is really these hardware and the software required for the cyber defense are really expensive, and they require consistent upgrades as well. So that's going to be one of the key challenges for the bank. And if you take impact of the banks in cyber threats, so based on the research paper, actually most customers actually highlighted in terms of their losing the trust with the bank is the one of the key challenge or the key concern. So which has a significant impact of 40%. So it actually contributes with in terms of with the coming data privacy acts, the regulations as with the GDPR and all. So the customers really worry about their private data or the data privacy which we been retained within the banks, and if there's a hacking incident happens and if their data get exposed, so this actually it will result in the losing the customer faith. So those are the key impacts when it comes to the banking. So I quickly go through a process for you to how to start when it comes to build a better cyber strategy. So basically, you have to identify your business requirements, starting from your business objectives, processes, assets, stakeholders. Stakeholders mean including your customers, suppliers, including your people you are working with through to your statement printing to your third-party partners, consultants, everybody. So based on that, you need to first identify your key business requirements, and then subsequently you have to do a gap assessment against the global frameworks, like example NIST, CIS control, PCI DSS, IS. There are plenty of global frameworks available. Then subsequently you can do a risk assessment, which actually complies of the technology risk, human risk, regulatory risk, and the service risk, and all of these risks. And subsequently, you have a better governance framework where you have the steering committees and your obviously information security steering committees and policies, procedures, guidelines, inventories, practices, and all these things has to be in place. So as part of the plan and development, you have to work on your based on the risk assessment, the risk treatment plans, threat mitigation, remediation plans, and the compensatory controls. And also part of once you have developed the plans, the next should be the implementation, the actual implementation of the risk treatment, as well as the continual review. You should probably have to go to the PDCA cycle, the plan do check cycle, to make sure this implementation is adequately in line with your business objectives of the bank. Right. So this is my last slide. So I want to highlight a few key takeaways for you. So actually, one of the key things, as I said, is the big data threat intelligence, which you have to harness from the data which you already have, including threat intel, to use against the cyber attacks which are taking globally as well as locally, to leverage on this intelligence to build your cyber strategy. As well, you have to make sure your patch and vulnerability management is adequately in place in your organization or the bank, and your supply chain attacks are adequately controlled, including you have better requirements, regulatory based controls are in place in terms of supply chain attacks, and also cyber attack simulations like red team, blue team assessment, pen testing. Those have to be done on a regular basis. Incident response and restoration capabilities has to be tested. And the segmentation is very important, where you actually segment your network into key several segments where you can minimize the damage of a cyber attack. So if you have a flat network, this obviously the attacker can start from one end and actually leverage on the network can move laterally to your critical segments. And next generation malware protection is always should be, it is not an option. You should have it in your banks, because nowadays threats are more, actually the most threats are purely crafted to you, the targeted attacks. So in that case, you will not be able to combat with the conventional strategies or the threat protection. You should have a proper network and web security, including your web application firewalls to network related perimeter and the internal firewalls. And adequate email protection is one of the key things. You have to make sure, including the emails, also have that next generation malware protection. And you need to have a better security awareness training program where you actually ensure your employees are in line with those policies, procedures, and do's and don'ts, and the best practices of the bank. And last not but the least is the security testing and the assurance part. You need to continuously test your systems, applications, and the security controls, and challenge them to ensure that you have it, you have adequately implemented them and the effectiveness of the security controls, and also make sure they are continuously monitored in terms of whether violations are in place or whether you have to bring up any additional controls. So thank you, everyone. So I have done my presentation.
Thank you very much, Suresh. Coming up next is Keisuke Kamata. Kamata-san is a regional director for Japan and Asia at Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or FSISAC. In 2011, he was with MUFG's cybersecurity strategy and capability. Since 2014, he has been involved with cybersecurity issues in the financial industry. He has published a book entitled Introduction to Cybersecurity Management. Let's now hear from Kamata-san.
Yeah, thank you very much. So everyone, nice to meet you. And this is my first time to come to the ABA event. And I'm from Tokyo. I'm based in Tokyo, and it's very good sunny sky in Tokyo. But actually, my background is colored leaves in autumn last year in Tokyo. So please enjoy the last year picture that I took. So I'm starting my slides. Can you see my slides? Is sharing okay? Okay, thank you. So initially I introduced about FS-ISAC. So FS-ISAC is Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's an industry consortium dedicated to reducing global financial services risk. So we are the organization association. We have a member around 7,000 members around the world, and we have staffs in Singapore, Japan, US, UK, Canada, and Europe countries. So we cover the global. So what we do is basically we do the sharing the information, knowledge, experience among the members, and also as FS-ISAC, we provide the intelligence analyst to provide the timely, actionable intelligence to all the members. So myself is Keisuke Kamata, as Bedo-san introduced. I have been working for cybersecurity over 18 years. So today's topic from me is training and capacity building for staffs and customers on cyber risks. So the training and capacity building for staffs and customers on cyber risk is, in my 18 years cybersecurity experience, it is really one of the biggest challenge on cybersecurity. It's a very difficult area. So actually, when you are going to find some materials or topics, what you need to teach to the staffs or customers, there are a lot of various different materials available on the internet for free. So there is always available. What we need to tell them, what they should do is always available. But based on the long experience, I see many of the content are too technical for non-technical audience. So the non-technical staffs or non-technical customers usually they are facing a difficulty to understand, like even please apply security patch. They don't know what is security patch, and they ask how to do that or something like that. So many of the content are available, but in reality, many of the customers or staffs really don't understand what it is. So a lot of the corporate policy or security policy says that you shouldn't do this, don't click suspicious email, don't go to the strange website, be careful ransomware, be careful malware. So always we teach them something like that. But many of the materials don't try to teach them why we shouldn't do that or what is the impact of doing that. That is one of the issues we are seeing. So today, cyber attacks are not just cyber attack. So everyone believes the cyber attack is more like IT, technical, very like hacking or those things. But actually, recently, the adversaries, attackers are trying to use more non-technical factors. Like they are trying to make a phone call to call center of the bank and try to trick them to become someone else. So they use malware or some technical aspect of the IT things, but they also use social engineering technique or non-technical factors to achieve their purpose. So before we talk about more details, we probably need to understand what is motivation of the adversaries, what kind of the people are actually doing the cyber attack, and what they will do, and what is the impact. So also we need to understand their attackers are highly motivated or supported. Supported means that they have the budget to do the cyber attacks. There are some cases, a nation state-sponsored cyber attack team is also existing. So initially, I talk about what is the motivation of cyber attackers. This is pretty simple. So most of the cyber attacks are trying to get money from you or from your bank, from your corporation. So many of the attackers are trying to steal credit card numbers to buy something and then sell it. That is getting the money. So many of the phishing sites try to steal the personal information. That is also trying to make money. So in many cases, cyber criminals stealing money, but it's hard to catch the criminals by law enforcement because of they attack from outside of your country. So also the other aspect of the cyber attack motivation is people try to get the information like from you, maybe intellectual property or corporate trade secret or corporate internal personal information. Those informations are always becoming target. So who are they? The many of the people believe the cyber attackers is something like this. They have wear the mask and they always type the keyboard, something like that. But in the reality, is where we see the pictures of the people arrested by the law enforcement on cyber crime. So it is just like a typical criminal. So it is really like normal people doing the cyber attack, try to stealing money or information. And in many cases, they don't do that alone. They become a group. Sometimes they become like a group of 100 people to do the one single cyber attack activities. So then what is the impact? What they do and what is the impact, the relationship of these impact. So we always teach the customers or staff about the phishing, but in the result of the phishing, we need to teach them that they use their information took by phishing site used to fraud money transfer or something like that. So the focusing on the teaching what they do is a good thing, but also we need to think about what is the impact of the doing that. So the relationship between what they do, what is the impact by that is important. And from the business or corporate administration perspectives, understanding the impact of cyber attack is more important. So this is just easy list of the threat and the impact relationship. So I just write down like ransomware, phishing site, business email compromise, advanced persistent threat, spear phishing. So those are the major famous threat around the world on the cyber attack. But from the impact side, ransomware causes business suspend or money loss. Phishing site shows personal money loss. So phishing sites steal information and the attackers use the information to steal money or something like that. So business email compromise also trying to steal money from the corporate. So when we educate people, the staff or customers, we also need to include what is the impact of the cyber attack. So it's really important for making them understand your money is target and your money will be stolen if you don't care about cyber attack. So that kind of the relationship between threat and impact understanding is very effective for customers or staffs to understand why they cannot click the suspicious email link or why they have to be careful about phishing site. So especially to customers, so of course it's really important to tell them don't click suspicious link, don't go to phishing site, please be careful someone is trying to make a fake call to you or something like that. But on the other side, there are some cases bank services, internet banking services do not have the good security level. So it's really important before you try to educate customers, make sure your service is secure enough in the world level. So also when we try to teach to customers, it's really important to make it easy to understand or easy to do. So there are always many materials or documents are saying that please apply security patch, update antivirus, so be careful malware, be careful phishing sites. So it's very important, of course, but most of the customers don't know how to do that. So make it easy to understand, easy to do. Please think about your mother or father, grandmother. Make sure that those people can do. So then also the right message to right people. This is another important thing. So please apply security patch is a good message for IT people. So if your customers are corporate customers, this message should go to the IT division of your corporate customers. So if your customer is more like a corporate top level executives, there is a different right message for corporate top level executives. So it's really important to what information we should deliver to what kind of people. So the right message to right people is always an important aspect to think about the education to staffs and customers. So then even if we take a lot of the effort on the educating staffs and customers, we still see a lot of the fraud or phishing, a lot of the cases still happen. So that is because even everyone try to be careful. It's always someone click the fraud email or someone go to phishing site and inputs their personal information. That always happens. So we have to assume thinking something will be happen one day. So considering the protect, detect, and respond model, someone already introduced this concept in previous presentation. So don't focus too much only on protection. So detection of the fraud or cyber attack activities or some damage is another important attitude to protect your corporate asset. So overall comments, so it's really important to recognize fighting against cyber attack is same as fighting against criminals. So the cyber attackers are criminal. They are trying to steal money or information from your corporation or bank, and you are facing with those criminals. So all staffs and customers, if they understand you cannot do this because if you do that, you're helping the criminal. And so people understand why they have to careful about cyber attack cases. Also, the other case is cyber attackers have a very strong motivation to steal something from you. So some of them are doing cyber attack by job, or some of them are doing because they are fired by IT company. So there are many cases, but they have really strong motivation to steal money or information from you. So then based on my experience, educating staffs or customers, it's really important to make them understand and make them feel it is dangerous, it is real, it is really happening, and something will come to them next. So the content or message, something they can feel or understand, is very effective. And recently, we use some video message, some dramatized video showing them what happened if they ignore their cybersecurity things. That works very well. So this is the last message. Providing good level of security together with your services is important. So in the financial services industry culture, we always think about the regulations or compliance matters. But in the cybersecurity area, so cybersecurity regulation or regulations usually telling just a brief information of what we have to do. So the regulation shows what direction we should go, but the regulation does not tell you the exact place you take a seat. So when you really implement some services or some security in your IT system or information assets, it's pretty much depending on bank side, what you actually implement, what you actually ask customers to do it. So good level of security is easy to say, but it is actually difficult. For doing that, it's really important to understand what threat actors are doing and what is the world situation where you are sitting now and where you are going. So understanding those things and implement the right security level is very important. So that's a brief introduction of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamata-san. Appreciate the presentation. Let's now go to the next presenter, is Michael Araneta, on bringing intelligence to cybersecurity management. Michael is head of research for IDC Financial Insights Asia Pacific. He regularly engages with key decision makers in top financial institutions and regulators as well. He is recognized as a thought leader in the region as the go-to analyst for a broad range of strategic and tactical issues such as M&A, product innovation, customer centricity, and CRM, core systems, vendor product portfolio positioning, customer channel effectiveness, and many topics. Let's now listen to Michael.
Thanks, Eugene, and a very pleasant afternoon to everyone. I'm speaking to you from Bangkok today. Got inspired by Kamata-san's background and everyone else's background with foliage. This is the reason why I've got a background that is representative of Bangkok, but is also green enough. But my role this afternoon will be to talk to you about what we have discussed so far and then bring them all together from the perspective of what organizations need to be doing and what is the ultimate ingredient to their response, which I think is going to be analytics and intelligence. Over the past couple of sessions, we have discussed the typical problems that we have seen in cybersecurity, especially in the midst of all these 2020 challenges. I have identified about 10 of them, but there will be some more important ones that I think we need to really highlight for today's session. There has been quite a bit of conversation around how different the year has been in terms of the types of cybersecurity challenges that we are seeing, but also there has been a lot of mention over the past couple of sessions around the frequency at which these attacks are occurring. Some of these we've made a mention to. Number one, for example, growing number of channels, devices, transactions, and environments to protect. We make a reference, for example, to I think the threats coming from all these smartwatches and all these Fitbit type of devices that suddenly introduce a different, I think, vulnerability point that we really have to fill. There's been mention, of course, with regard to number 8, new infrastructure considerations around cloud, for example, in how we need to be able to understand not only the security implications that would face us, especially as we move more and more of our workloads and data to cloud, but especially as we will rely on cloud moving forward, how are we going to bring down the logs and take the logs coming from all these cloud usage that we are going to forecast, that we are seeing to grow significantly in the next couple of years. There has been mentioned as well on number 2, sophistication of cyber threats that are growing rapidly. Let's recognize that this is a illegitimate business, but is actually a business coming from the cyber criminals of the world. We just don't know where they're coming from, or probably we do have a sense of where they're coming from, but this is hyper-organized type of activities that we should not really underestimate. And also our first speaker, I think Jeremy really did bring up a very good point around how the focus on cybersecurity needs to be a lot more nuanced, but also I think responsive to the unique and real challenges of our time. There was mention, for example, in terms of how cybersecurity is really part of the overall risk management framework. But I think there is a requirement for us now to really look at cybersecurity in specific and be very specific around all the protections as well as the procedures we really need to do in order to feel and believe that our organizations as banks and insurance and capital market players would really need to be be met significantly. There are unique risk management considerations that we have to have with regard to security. Another big topic over the past couple of years was identity integration, number 4. And that has something to do with at least 6 regulations or at least government initiatives in the Asia-Pacific region to start integrating identity of individuals. Now, of course, we as financial services institutions have been the repository of this trusted identity given to us by the customers. But with this identity integration that's happening across multiple industries, multiple companies, we have to participate in that identity integration process. And that obviously opens up not only vulnerabilities, but also possibilities that we will be victimized by these activities of identity integration, whether it is customers that are starting to look at their data being shared to third parties or outside of banking in the spirit of open banking. There are new vulnerabilities that are emerging that might be caused by regulation or government, but also caused by the ultimate vulnerability, which would be people, right? And there was mention over the past couple of sessions around how we need to educate our customers a lot more effectively. Cybercrime as a business, I've already mentioned that is a big business worldwide, especially in this downturn, this crisis that we are facing. There is business reason, business motivation why they should be able to increase their activities as well, simply because there is money involved. Number 6, proliferation of security tool sets. Quite an interesting piece of work that we have at IDC, which would be to look at all the solutions that are available to us. And it would be very easy for us to see in a typical financial services organization at least 47 tools to be able to support our cybersecurity capabilities, whether it's through threat intelligence, detection, protection, or the response itself. 47 tools. That is a very complicated task to bring all these tools and capabilities together, and we need to start orchestrating them so that not only do we see some form of cost optimization, investment optimization, but also to make sure that they work together, and as they work together, they fill in all the gaps with regard to cybersecurity. Number 7, no need to belabor this point. We will continue to suffer this scarcity of qualified information security professionals. Even with the extent of automation that's happening in cybersecurity, there will continue to be a lack of good and quality personnel to support us in our next generation investments into cybersecurity. New infrastructure, security considerations, and solutions with regard to cloud, I already mentioned that. But the 9th and 10th is something that is the key point of my session today, which is that speed of response actually matters. Our customers, our users are really used to making decisions fast, but also having a great response coming from this digital world. And our ability to be able to make decisions on cybersecurity needs to be as fast as well. This calls for this primacy of analytics that I will talk about later, especially as we really look at the greater use of intelligence and an analytics that allows us to be more intelligent as an enterprise to respond and respond very well. So over this slide, I've talked about some of the issues that have been very relevant in our discussions today, but I will extend this conversation by talking about what do we really need, right? We talk about all these 47 solutions for cybersecurity, but ultimately, what is the key capability that we need? And if you look at the capability of our institution, there are several problems that are emerging, right? We tend to be very focused on all these solutions, the 47 solutions that I already mentioned, but what they have actually given us would be a whole level of new problems, especially as we attempt to respond very well. There is a volume problem that is happening in our enterprise. In other words, too many alerts and too many false positives. Look at all these solutions that we have invested on, and suddenly they give us so much data, but also so much information that we have to act on. And the level of false positives continue to increase simply because all these rules-based, usually rules-based type of systems are really working on all data, and suddenly this new types of behavior that we are spotting throw up a lot of these triggers and alerts, and therefore we've never seen too many false positives and too many alerts in the first place. We have been working on rules-based threat modeling, right? And there was a very good statement earlier on that said that there is new behavior, and therefore this new behavior that is exhibited by our customers, by our end users, really need to be accounted for. Unfortunately, we are working on old type of behavior, information about customers, activities of our customers that are based on the pre-COVID-19 world. And suddenly, as we use this new information against the rules-based threat modeling that we still continue to use, then obviously that explains why there's this profusion of alerts that we are facing. I also mentioned this long-standing problem of having too few good professionals, your tier 1 security analysts, for example, even if they're coming into the job market very quickly, we can never give them the right tools, but also the right training. There's too many alerts for too few staff, and it gets more and more complicated, especially as you look at the very highly qualified security professionals. There is also a dwell time problem, which is a complication out of this volume problem that I earlier talked about. We are prone to manual investigation. Not a lot of our processes are automated, too many threats to go through, and it's too difficult to interpret trends. And later on, I'll talk about probably the use of machine learning to be able to allow us to connect the dots between one event that we're tracking versus another event that we are tracking, and to actually see that they are related to each other. And it's too difficult to really interpret the connections of all these alerts that are being thrown at us. There's also a prioritization problem, which I'd really like to spend a lot of emphasis on, particularly because this phenomenon that we are seeing of this profusion of too many alerts also calls for a prioritization. Which alerts do we need to prioritize? And we need to have an ability to triage the problem, right? To be able to understand this particular security incident is going to have a critical issue or a significant impact to the organization, and we need to prioritize that. Unfortunately, there's just too many that we are paying attention to, and the previous speakers did actually mention phishing capabilities. Suresh did mention that, spam, malware, botnets that we are fighting against. How do we prioritize these problems? Because although we can organize these problems into a quadrant of sorts to prioritize a propensity of this event happening versus impact to the organization, every problem is actually not the same, and every problem is nuanced and contextualized to the organization. And every organization would have different criticalities of systems, processes, and people, but they also have different levels of impact, whatever kind of threat and vulnerability that you are facing. So there's really no quantification of every threat. There has to be a quantification of the threat in the context of the organization, but also in the context of what really is happening at a particular point in time. And then, of course, there's no action, there's an action problem that we are facing. No actionable insight when we get the alert, when we know that this is a legitimate problem we have to look at. There's no insight around how exactly are we going to respond, right? What is the best course of action? Which of the 47 tool sets do we need to orchestrate or to allow us to respond very well? And which are we supposed to use best? So no actionable insight about the action itself. We've done a lot of training and a lot of practice, all these red team type of activities, but I think, yeah, there's really we do not generally know how to act in the event of a breach. We call our crisis management team, security teams, everyone gets involved. And even if it's a small issue, then everyone gets involved as well. So there is a fatigue issue in our response as well, in that, every single problem that we see gets reported to the entire team, when in fact it could have been remediated quickly with just an orchestration of tools and response, and no sense of value of effort. But I think that's more an ROI type of calculation in the end. So what we have done at IDC, this is, in the last 3 minutes of my presentation, I'd like to talk about what really is the appropriate response. And we've called this AIRO, and this has some of the, we make a reference here as well to threat and vulnerability management. But if you organize the 47 tool sets of cybersecurity into these 4 buckets, if you will, I think we will do well, and we would be able to solve at least a majority of our problems and a significant, super majority of our problems as well. So what is the right response? And we call this AIRO or AIRO, making a reference also to this IAI phenomenon that we are seeing. But ultimately, AIRO is made out of analytics to drive insight into the threat dynamics. In the previous session, there was talk about how we need to be able to look at all the threats that are happening outside, threats that are happening internally, but we need the analytics to drive insight into the changes into the dynamics of these internal and external factors. Are we seeing more threats coming from outside? What types of activities are happening? Is there phishing activity that's happening as well? Or is it a botnet activity that we suddenly need to be aware of, mainly because we've opened up our channels yesterday or last week? Analytics to drive insight into threat dynamics really need to be the basis of our response. We need to be able to use intelligence to index and collect sources of information. This makes a reference to our reliance on threat intelligence, right? To know what is happening outside, and then to suddenly be able to bring them all together so that we look at them as a whole, and we do not look at one threat intelligence feed as by itself. And this is the ability of our organization to make connections of all these intelligence that we are seeing. So we might use artificial intelligence, machine learning in this particular capability, but intelligence to make connections of these sources of information very, very important. Third is the triage and initiation of the proper response. I mentioned we need to prioritize which threat is most important to us, but we also need to start looking at prioritizing them according to criticality as well. In Jeremy's presentation, he said that there is an ongoing effort of banks to understand what are the critical business processes, applications and systems that we really need to pay attention to. We expect that to really continue, but this will be the basis of the triage and initiation of proper response that we need to have. And then finally, orchestration of these multiple tool sets to mitigate a threat and to harden the network, to be able to orchestrate not only the capabilities of your tech investments, but also your technology teams to be able to respond very well. So orchestration, not just necessarily about all the tools that are available to us, but also the processes and people involved in our response. I also bring this up particularly because a lot of this AIRO capability is actually based on analytics and intelligence, but just as a reminder of the different level of analytics that we really need to have, especially in 2020. In preparation for 2021, we need to understand that our requirements for analytics and intelligence would be completely different from where we were in 2019. First, power of predictive. AI and ML, as well as predictive analytics, have expanded considerably in terms of capabilities, that we have new capabilities we've never had before. And ability to be able to predict the most likely outcome of our actions is a great improvement of our analytics, in fact, over the past year or so. We also need to use new data. Let's remember that the behaviors that we were feeding into our rules-based systems are completely different from what is happening in 2020. Look at the amount of people working from home, the amount of work that is being delivered from home, the number of digital transactions that we are facing. These are new behaviors that we really have to account for. And third, enterprise-wide consumption of on-time, trusted, and comprehensive data and analytics to be able to pull them together. But finally, I think a call to action here would be we need to rebuild our model so that we are able to make decisions based on accurate, reliable, current data, and then be able to respond to the most significant but also the most realistic threats of our time. Finally, some of the new capabilities that we are facing in the future, analytics to make our cybersecurity better. These would be some of the capabilities that hopefully, as we implement this AIRO framework in our organizations, will be able to allow us to be a lot more effective in our cybersecurity response. First, greater use of machine learning, to reduce the redundant alerts, the profusion of alerts that we are facing. They can make connections, be able to allow us to prioritize as well. So machine learning, very capable there. We also need analytics to show us and not just tell us, so that we need to almost visualize through some visualization technique what the proper response is and what the outcome would be for particular courses of action that we might have alternatives for. So this directs the analyst or the entire organization to which alerts they should address first. Circle of life, we need to have a posture that remediates alerts right away through some automation, but also to be able to track the effectiveness of our response so that we learn as an organization. We also need to quantify threats based on veracity and criticality, and then it blends, our response blends into some capability around security operations so that our security response gets integrated very well into how we are organized operationally as a bank. So control the workflow of the analyst for IT ticketing, for benchmarks, and so on. These are the 5 capabilities that we expect as we implement this AIRO framework that I talked about. I thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm sure that we will have a great panel discussion later.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. Thank you. Our last panel speaker is Ross McNaughton on cyber risk insurance. Ross is a seasoned CISO and cybersecurity professional. He currently serves as the CISO for Gulf Bank in Kuwait, where he provides strategic framework and direction in information and cybersecurity risk. He has over 20 years of specialized experience in over 12 countries, accelerating cybersecurity adoption and modernization programs for large financial institutions. He is consistently sought out for advice throughout his industry and in thought leadership circles, and has worked with more than 30 companies and 16 banks. Ross, please.
Thank you very much, Eugene. Thanks for the intro. And hello to all of our attendees on the webinar. Today I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive for everyone on one of the topics we haven't actually really discussed much is what is the aftermath of an incident? What's happened once an organization has had an event and needs to do some cleanup? Now, part of that is cyber insurance. Now, we're going to go through a number of topics here. Firstly, what are the advantages of cyber insurance? How do we ensure we have the correct coverage? How do we value how much do we actually need from cyber insurance providers? What are the questions we should be asking our insurers to ensure that our expectations are actually being met from our cyber insurance coverage? How to deal with third parties and cyber insurance and breaches that result from third parties, and where does our coverage lie? How do we ensure that we are protected as banks? And then discussions around risk management, risk acceptance, and how do these concepts actually affect our insurance coverage that the organization has? Firstly, why do we need cyber insurance? We as banks, we insure everything. We insure banking operations, we insure cash management, we insure how we handle fire, flood, damage. We insure robbery insurance, we have ATM insurance. We insure everything for the circumstances we can't predict, unforeseen circumstances. Now, over the last 8-9 years, there's been an introduction in cyber insurance. And this is exactly for the same reason, to insure against something that we cannot foresee. It doesn't mitigate the risk and doesn't add any value to us if we don't have a good control environment in the first place. And we'll talk about some of that later on how insurers look at organizations that have cyber insurance and the questions that we need to put back and forward between the insurers. And then we're going to talk a bit about risk transference to an insurer. This is obviously a common accepted methodology of how do we deal with our risks. Do we accept them or do we transfer them to the insurer? But does our coverage actually cover us if we transfer this risk? If management has accepted stuff, does our coverage actually take effect on there? So what do we get when we have insurance? We actually get quite a lot. We get forensics coverage. Forensics companies, when they hear an organization has had a breach, they rub their hands. They're like, this is the cash cow for them. Their immediate response billable hours are just through the roof, and they love it. So, and organizations do need this kind of level of protection, because often these attacks are very sophisticated. People don't know where the issues are. They can't identify it. So they do need these expertise in-house, this significantly skilled expertise to identify the sources. And that comes at a cost. It also covers the PR side of things. You know, we as banks, if we have issues, we need to make sure that the public is reassured that we minimize the damage to the external, because the first thing that happens is social media blows up. The first thing that happens is there's people looking at, okay, the bank is down, what's happening, all these kinds of issues. So PR is very important when it comes to managing an incident and a crisis, and you need to make sure that you've got really good organizations backing you up. Cyber insurance protects you with this. Legal fees, cost of recoveries. As banks, you know, sometimes cash out events from ATMs. Sometimes it's cards being breached or debit cards being automatically reloaded. These sorts of events happen all the time. Sometimes it's financial losses. So we need to have legal involvement and legal agencies following up with other banks, other regulators, different countries to try and recover monies for us. Cleanup costs. Obviously, in some cases, when organizations, either physical issues within the organization, if it's been a ransomware or a destructive event, we need to clean things up, and we need to pay suppliers to come in, again, at a moment's notice and saying, we don't care, we need to get this done right now. However much it costs, we need to be back operational because our bank is down. So in these cases, the cleanup costs of these activities are actually covered under this. Lost revenue, when you have business interruption, can sometimes also be covered by these kind of policies. But how do we deal with what it doesn't cover? And we'll talk about other insurances as part of this and how we blend together a combination of cyber insurance with your banker's bond. You know, your blanket bond that you have that covers most of these other things, because it doesn't cover financial fraud loss. Now, you would think cyber insurance, if I get hacked and money's gone, my cyber insurance should cover it. No, it doesn't. That is actually normally covered by your banker's blanket bond under financial theft. And this is where some of the same questions that we're going to talk about later, you need to ask your banker's bond cover. Again, if you have a physical disruption event, like a malware that goes in and starts damaging servers, hard drive damage, or you have a ransomware event and you don't want to pay out, you need to actually make sure that you have physical damage coverage, and often your physical damage policies for environmental, fire, flood, IT equipment damage do not cover you for cyber malware. So there are often options in these policies to cover for these specific types of, as they're known, bricking events. Prior events. If your organization already has someone inside, you have suspected there are issues, or the control group knows about issues. Now, the control group is usually defined as the senior IT management, security management, risk management. If there are known issues within your organization and you haven't highlighted these issues to the insurer, they will not cover you. So again, you have to be very clear and upfront to your insurer about a lot of your issues, so you can ensure you actually have something that's worthwhile. And this is where we talk about here. Card fraud. Card fraud is often excluded because, oh, that's the problem with the acquirer of the transaction. Not really, because if you have reload events within your organization, or where your system is compromised, an attacker is removing funds from your customers' cards, but then reloading it through your systems, you actually have a shared responsibility there on the fact that your system was compromised and your cards were being reloaded in the back end. And there was an example of this in the bank about 4 or 5 years ago, where constantly debit cards and prepaid cards were just constantly being reloaded, and a massive cash out took place. The physical damage we've already talked about. If you have a data privacy event where and this is much more prevalent nowadays because people are working at home, they're using laptops a lot. If it is not encrypted, your insurer will not cover you for any data breach or data privacy events because you didn't have correct controls in place. We need to be very careful about how we handle privacy fines. Obviously, with the introduction of GDPR, and also regionally, there are many privacy laws coming into place that actually match your revenue with the amount that you're fined. And we've actually seen that in Europe, where in the UK, they have been going for the maximum 2% of global revenue of organizations, not just the local revenue of the country the event happened in, but the global revenue of the organization as a fine. And that's been happened very publicly over the last few years. So the insurance does cover it, but we need to make sure that we have sufficient coverage to mitigate fines that may come to the organization. Mental health costs for staff. During these crisis events, staff are very stressed. You may have issues of burnout. You may have issues of overworked staff that are already, as we've already discussed earlier, facing massive event fatigue because every event is important. So during a crisis event, this can push them over the edge. You will have massive issues of staff resilience, having mental health issues, and these need to be insured as part of that policy. And you can add clauses in there to ensure that that happens. Cloud loss. There's been a number of events where you've had administrators that have massive access to systems, and with the proliferation of cloud technologies, 500 servers sitting in the cloud. One button press, they're gone. And again, the lack of controls on these ones is often not covered. So you need to make sure the cloud-specific cover is in there. And how do you do this? Scenario-based questions to the insurer. This is actually the most important part of your process with your insurer. And quite often your broker will be in the middle with this, sitting looking at some of these questions going, why on earth are they not asking these questions? And you need to ask it both your cyber insurer and your banker's bond provider, because some of it relates to financial loss events and some of it relates to the coverage when you are actually covered. Now, you need to actually be honest as part of this. You need to be wide open with your insurer about your current control environment state, because if there's an event happens and then it is discovered that your control environment differed significantly from what you had discussed with them in the first place, they can often refuse to provide coverage. So you actually go to the insurer and throw events at them and say, what if I have a failure in process? What if I had something that existed within the environment that the teams knew about but management didn't know about, and then an event occurred because either a hacker managed to get into the system or the system fell over, we had a business continuity event. Are you still going to pay out on my policy? What if it was a deliberate act from one of the trusted administrators? What about a deliberate act by the security administrators, the very people we are paying to control our environments? Again, throw these scenarios at the insurer, get it in writing. Often the insurer will try to have it as a workshop, and you need to go back and make sure in writing that you have it in writing. Will we be covered if we have this? Nation state events. Now, this is the one that insurers love to have as their get out clauses: war, terrorism, exclusions. And it's always at the bottom, hidden in the policy. So you have to go back, and there are actual court cases in progress right now against cyber insurers that didn't pay out because they claimed that malware events or hacking groups were linked to nation states, either direct attribution through an event or indirectly. So, for example, NotPetya, the malware that came out a few years ago, that was took down many organizations. A lot of times the insurers are claiming that's a nation state group. They're linked to a nation state group, therefore we are not going to pay because it's war. Or when you have actual regional tensions that are announced. For example, a few years ago, you had the Saudi-Yemen war, and there were massive numbers of cyber attacks during that time from Anonymous that were designed to attack organizations that were supporting governments. Are those considered nation-state events and excluded from the policy? Throw these scenarios at your insurer in writing to make sure that you know exactly when and when you will not be covered, or whether they will use language like, we will see at the time, which is quite often the response that you will get. Some insurers will put it black and white, yes, you are covered, yes, you're covered, but you have to go to them. Also, these prior known issues are very dangerous because how does that link with the risk management process? And we'll talk about that again later. What about bad practices within your organization? If your organization doesn't have good controls, good processes in place, is that considered negligence? Is negligence excluded? How is that defined? Because everyone here knows that you're never 100%. It's always a constant battle to keep your systems up and running, keep them secured, keep evolving the bank. Because banks are some of the most complex organizations. They don't stand still. There's constantly new applications, new systems, new things coming in because we have to run businesses. So control environments have to always catch up with these things because we're in a fast-moving industry. So if we have bad practices, if our controls are not in place, how does that actually work with the insurance policy? If controls weren't in place, the process was ineffective. Ransomware, we were talking about earlier about illegal payments of ransomware demands. What if the organization does not have the capability to recover from ransomware? They don't have the right backups, or they don't have software capabilities to recover from it. How will that be paid? Do they apply intermediaries in the process to make sure that the ransom can be paid while still keeping you within the bounds of the law? Hardline exclusions. What will absolutely the insurer not pay for? You know, for example, knowledge of the senior management, the executive management as part of the process. So all these things have to be taken and questioned to the insurer. Third parties. Now, one of the largest risk groups that organized face is risk that comes through to you from third parties. Now, are we covered? How does it impact them? If they are hacked and then we are hacked as a result, how does that happen? Breach liability clauses are really important on this. Will the insurer sue your third party? Will they take them to court? Are there any limitations on liability in that contract? Quite often, insurers demand that you have equivalent cyber insurance from your third parties, or that they take liability for any losses in your organization. And these sorts of things need to be clarified, not only with your organization, but with your third party. Because you may sit back and go, yep, great, I've got my cyber insurance, the event happens, my banker's bond is tight, and then your insurers go and sue your third party and put them out of business, and then you've got a bigger risk from an availability of your organization and your supply chain. So these issues need to be discussed. Valuing your insurance coverage, because quite often more is not better. Applying the right policies in the right places. So your cleanup costs in your cyber insurance, your financial losses in your banker's bond and your theft components, the valuation of these. And there's some examples here on this slide, which we will get later, that tell you how to value these things. There's cost of breach studies. You can look at your return on security investment, loss avoidance calculations, because this is what the insurers do when they're looking at it. And also look at how much your fines are going to be. Risk acceptance is a challenging one. If your management has signed off on risks and those risks then occur, how is your insurance going to deal with it? Because the control group knew. The top management have put their signatures on a piece of paper saying, I accept this risk, I'm going to launch this product with these risks, and the event occurs. How is that dealt with? So a lot of these questions that are on this slide need to be asked to your insurer to assure the organization that you have correct cover and how they deal with this. Because no bank is compliant at all times. Now, recapping, it's all about questioning your insurer, having your scenarios clearly identified, and what are going to be the contention points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross. That was half scary and half insightful. I'm sure there are I have questions related to that. Now, let's go straight to the questions. We can, I know we're slightly over time. We can start with Alan. There are several questions on third party. Third party liability or insurance has, I think, about 4 questions. Alan, if we allow third party what's this? If we allow third party provide offsite IT support by remoting, what controls should be put in place to mitigate the risk? Alan? Where's Alan? Oh, we lost Alan.
I think he's offline.
Oh, he's offline. Maybe we can pass the question on to Suresh, who was talking about a similar topic.
Yeah, so I'll take that question. So basically, before you do any outsourcing activity, what you have to do is a third part of the outsourced service provider based risk assessment. So based on the risk assessment, you will come up with the risk based on the information you are planning to sharing with the third party. So actually that risk assessment also should consist of your regulatory and statutory requirement and the data and privacy protection requirements regulations as well. So based on that, the risk assessment only you will come up with the whatever the security strategies you're going to implement. So basically you have to contractually bind with the third party, as well as you have to do the on-site visits to make sure the security controls are in place, as well as in contract we put it the right to audit. So periodically the reviews of the third party services and the arrangements, and make sure that your compliance is in order at all times. So basically the periodic reviews, and also when you initiate, you do the risk assessment, based on the risk you identify, you have to do the proper risk treatment and the controls implemented, as well as the periodic review.
Thank you. There was a question raised which was answered by Kamata-san, but I think it's important that he answers this question publicly. The question was, with regard to cyber criminals, any idea on the sanctions for them best practice globally to reduce cybersecurity risk? Reducing them could be the best, meaning the cyber criminals, including prohibition of their business. I'm curious about this as well, Kamata-san.
Oh, okay. So in reality, catching the cyber criminals is really hard because there are many different technology that they can hide their places for attacking. So, for example, if I attack to Philippines from Tokyo, so I can have a lot of different methodologies to make it the attack looks like come from the other countries like Sri Lanka or China or Russia or anywhere. So I can choose. So even if you investigate some logs in your server, you can find someone from the country that is not Japan. So I can do that. So I can tell more detail, but I just skip it. So it's really hard to find the location of the criminal who is actually doing that. So what's happening now is there are many international banks closely work with law enforcement, especially with FBI, to identify the location of the criminal. So they take a lot of effort and a long time, the internet traffic monitoring to identify what attacking campaign is doing from where, what location, what country, what city, what apartment, what room number, so something like that. So I know several criminal catching cases, and some of them, I know the detail, they took like 7 years until they identify the location of the head of the criminal group. So even if they arrest the head of the criminal group, so other member of the criminal group distributed around the world. So there are famous cases called Avalanche. So that's the head of the avalanche group was arrested in Ukraine, but there are only one person arrested and others escaped. And then they form other group and conducting the new cyber crime, the money fraud activities now. And then the law enforcement is investigating. So this is public information. So the reality is hard to catch a criminal, identify the location, who it is.
Yeah.
Then there are also the law enforcement and the many banks are working together to identify those things. It takes years. So that is a reality.
That's the reality. Thank you, Kamata-san. The next question is for Michael. How will banks balance between strengthening cybersecurity and extending digital facilities in the COVID-19 world, where, as they're suggesting, the situation is forcing banks to provide more and more digital services?
So one of the key things that we need to remember is that the advancement of technology capabilities has really happened very quickly, both from a negative side, in that the ability of these criminals or these hackers to be able to get into our systems has really matured. But we also need to recognize that our abilities to defend and protect ourselves have also improved significantly. And so we need to recognize that. And I think, unfortunately, we might need to continue on investing in all these point solutions. To add to the 47 tools that we might already have, we might end up with more tools, but that would still be something that is going to allow us to operate in a more digital world. But ultimately, what we need to remember is that we need to recognize that we are in a very different world now, right? We're ultimately more digital, but the level of transactions that we are seeing in the digital world has really increased significantly, and therefore we cannot stop them, because that is really part of our business moving forward. Our business has to change, and therefore the principles by which we operate our business needs to change as well. I was speaking to one CISO just today as well, who said that they have changed their position from just being from not allowing people to do things, but allowing people to do things, but letting them know that they are being watched, so that the moment or the point at which some suspicious activity is happening, they will be able to inform the person appropriately. And that is something that we need to really recognize as this shift in terms of paradigm from protection at all costs to allowing people to do and continue work, but letting them know that we are on top of the situation.
Thank you, Michael. There's a question here which was sent early on, and Ross, I'd like you to take a look at this. For some banks in the Philippines, the CISO reports to the CRO based on the governance structure, while the cybersecurity officer reports to the CIO or the CTO. What is the recommended, based on your experience, the recommended and effective organizational structure to ensure that both professionals work hand in hand?
And the answer in this, it does sometimes depend on the regulatory environment. Sometimes regulatory requirements mandate first line, second line separation, but a lot of this is mitigated through roles and responsibility and assigning accountability. Quite often the second line doesn't have accountability for ensuring things are in place. Their job is to point out. Whereas if the tone from the top is very key, that accountability of the security of the organization is driven down to both these individuals within the organization, it doesn't actually matter their reporting line, because they will both report into a security steering committee that has the full accountability for the organization. And in all honesty, they can't do their jobs without each other. It's all part of the plan, do, check, act cycle. One has to actually do, and one has to actually check. So you have to ensure that the IT security or cyber security teams are actually being monitored, because there is so much to do. So the second line helps the first line understand the weak areas, the first line fixes them. And then both entities are responsible for ensuring the organization's safety, because ultimately we're here to protect the bank and do business.
Thank you, Ross. We don't have much time, but there's this question I would like everyone to take a shot at. It's about the threat of quantum computers. This is Lito from Manila, who wrote that he understands that several organizations and countries are engaging in the development of quantum computers. And he is implying that there's massive threat if cyber criminals will be able to use or get access to these super machines. Any thoughts on how quantum computers can have impact, threats, and other effects, adverse effects on various stakeholders? Who would like to? This is a question for everyone, or anyone who would like to answer that. Oh. Mike, you're on mute.
Okay, I'd go first.
Okay.
So I would suppose that, quantum computing there's an ongoing race for quantum computing in the world. And so that when somebody succeeds to somehow be able to use quantum computing in this way to be the ultimate cyber criminal using quantum computing, word would eventually get out. Right, and I think that is something that, because this is a pride issue for the quantum computing enthusiasts in the world. It is expensive, it's very difficult to undertake, and therefore there's a pride involved too. And these cyber criminals might, be too much full of themselves that word gets out. So hopefully we will be able to know what is happening, that which pace this development of quantum computing for use for the negative will happen, and also hopefully we'll be able to protect ourselves adequately. But quantum computing is something that we expect to, I think, mature in the next 5 years. There's that ongoing race, as I mentioned, but hopefully it will be used more for good than for bad.
Okay, thank you, Mike. There's another. Why don't we pick just 2 more questions, then we'll call it a day. This question I'm curious as well. Should a company provide a staff or an officer's personal device access to the company's data? Ross, would you like to take a shot at this? Should we?
Well, I know my own stance on this, and the answer is absolutely not. But there are organizations with different situations, different financing, different. People are forced to work, and often there are not corporate laptops available. After COVID, there was suddenly a global shortage in countries of laptops as everyone went out and bought laptops. But ultimately, if you don't have control of that endpoint, you're opening yourself up to a significant risk, and you can't apply a lot of the normal monitoring controls that your cyber team need to be able to at least identify initial threats. So from my own perspective, it's very much a case of no, we do not like personal devices, just because it's an unknown, and dealing with that and allowing it to be able to potentially connect into our environment exposes us to so much risk and the threats are being targeted at the end users. They're not being targeted at the organization nowadays. They're targeting people's personal devices. They don't have the best controls. They don't have these endpoint antivirus solutions. They don't have these advanced detection and response services that the bank has invested so much money to purchase and deploy. So from that side of things, that it's a risk that's probably not worth taking for the cost of a laptop.
Yeah, it's somebody just sent a question right now. What are some of the world's leading cyber insurance companies? Because they're not aware of the names.
You will find the organizations, you've got your normal insurance groups. You have groups such as Aon, you have brokerage agencies that supply them. They're then underwritten by the same people that do our bankers' bond insurance companies. So, you know, cyber insurance is just another offering, and then you're usually backed up by specialists.
Okay, yeah, thank you. There's maybe we can have this as our last question for Suresh. How important is it to have an SOC in the bank to proactively monitor the events, occurrences, and to mitigate it before any damage is done to the organization? What's your experience on this, Suresh?
Yeah, so this SOC refers to the Security Operating Center. So basically, having a Security Operating Center actually complements you to have a better overview of the attacks and the threats are coming into your environment. So basically, you integrate all your logs and the threat feeds to a kind of Security Operating Center. You start monitoring them. Generally, it's the best practice to have it 24/7. So based on that, you will generally have the correlation rules, which are and alerts set it up, and basically automatic escalations, and the search. Sometimes even the mature environments with automatic remediation as well. So it is really important to have rather kind of a reactive approach where you have proactively you identify what are the threats coming into your environment and what are the movements in your environment, as well as then you have the capability to proactively have a better incident management process where you escalate your threats into the incident management process, and then you have your response strategies and the response plans in place where you proactively respond to these threats. So it is really important in terms of having a proper plan and basically a better security operating center, and where you proactively identify threats, as well as then you have the proactive way of mitigating threats.
Thank you, Suresh. Thank you very much, gentlemen. This activity has been greatly informative. I am sure our audience has benefited from your insights and most likely, just like me, have some checklists of what to do later when we go back to our offices. We thank the audience for their active participation, and we are grateful to the Asian Bankers Association for organizing this event. Good afternoon. I wish we had more time, but meantime, please keep well. Thank you very much.